In the early years of the 19th century, this vast expanse of West Texas was the domain of the sun, the wind, and the Indians. The white man's settlements had not yet stretched this far west. One branch of the great Comanche War Trail, which stretched from the Texas Panhandle to Mexico, passed the springs here, which now bear its name. 49ers on their way to California gold fields also passed through here, along the San Antonio, El Paso, San Diego Road, which became a main thoroughfare west. By 1858, the Butterfield Overland Mail Company raced competing carriers from Comanche Springs to California. The abundant waters of Comanche Springs attracted all these travelers to the arid land west of the Pecos River. As a result, Indian depredations increased dramatically as they fought this invasion of their lands. Mescalero Apache lived in the mountains of West Texas and New Mexico and preyed upon these travelers in the area. In 1858, the federal government established Camp Stockton at Comanche Springs to provide safe escort to travelers and commerce along the San Antonio-El Paso Road. The small post was named in honor of a naval officer, Commodore Robert Field Stockton, a hero of the 1840s war with Mexico. In 1859, Camp Stockton, whose name was changed in 1860 to Fort Stockton, was used as a base of operations for 2 of the 3 experimental U.S. Army camel trains exploring the Big Bend area of Texas. The object of these expeditions was to test the usefulness of the camel as a pack animal in the rough, dry terrain of the southwestern deserts, which took such a heavy toll on Army mules and horses. The maneuvers proved to be a practical success, but a political failure, as their prime enthusiast was Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, who broke his ties with the federal government to become President of the Confederacy. When Texas seceded from the Union, federal troops abandoned Fort Stockton and other posts in Texas and left the state. By the end of the Civil War, nothing remained of the military buildings at Fort Stockton. With the departure of federal troops from the area, West Texas was once again ruled by the Indian bands who preyed upon the travelers and scattered settlements. The death toll mounted. Commerce and settlement in the area were in severe jeopardy. Congress finally heeded Texans' pleas to return soldiers to the frontier. In July of 1867, Companies A, B, E, and K of the 9th Cavalry, under the command of Colonel Edward Hatch, arrived to reestablish Fort Stockton at its present site, 1/2 mile northeast of the first post on 960 acres adjacent to Comanche Creek. The 9th Cavalry was one of 4 new regiments created by Congress in 1866 to enlist the many black men who sought enlistment in the U.S. Army. Because the Army was segregated, black men could not serve in white regiments. Many of these new recruits were ex-slaves with no previous military experience who had no way to earn a living in the chaos of post-Civil War Reconstruction. These black enlisted men served under white officers. The new black regiments were sent to the far reaches of the frontier to fight the Indians. They were given the name Buffalo Soldiers by the Plains Indians, who likened their dark curly hair to that on the head and shoulders of the buffalo. Despite lack of experience, harsh conditions, and racial prejudice, the Buffalo Soldiers proved to be hardy, dependable, and courageous troops. Companies from all 4 black regiments served at Fort Stockton and played a major role in the settlement and development of the American West. Because the federal government owned no land in Texas, Army posts were built on land leased from private owners. Peter Gallagher, an entrepreneur from San Antonio, filed claim to lands near Comanche Creek and leased them to the Army for $800 a year. Construction on the new fort began immediately. Soldiers and civilian contract labor quarried stone from nearby mesas for the guardhouse powder magazine and foundations for the other buildings. Adobe bricks were made locally for the walls. Construction was slow due to the lack of trees in the area for lumber and the great distances supplies had to travel. Pre-cut lumber for the first buildings came by ship to Texas ports and then overland 500 miles by ox cart to Fort Stockton. No fence or palisade ever surrounded the fort. The wide open spaces provided no cover for someone planning a surprise attack on the fort. Dust from anyone's approach was visible miles before the traveler was within rifle range. Eventually, 30 to 40 buildings were built here, including 5 enlisted men's barracks. 8 officers' quarters were built, one of which burned in an early morning fire in November 1872, apparently from coals rolling from the fireplace onto the wooden floor. The post hospital and guardhouse were built at the south end of the parade grounds. The guardhouse, one of the 4 original buildings left at historic Fort Stockton, was one of the first to be built. A stone set into the south wall records its completion in 1868 by Lieutenant J.L. Humphreyville, quartermaster. 3 of the companies that established the fort mutinied before arriving here. 1 officer died and 3 soldiers were shot to keep order. The 3 solitary confinement cells and larger holding cell in the guardhouse were undoubtedly first occupied by men of these mutinous companies. Although it was never attacked, the fort was constantly on guard against Indians. The Apache usually struck isolated settlements or travelers and were well away before the garrison was notified. Fort Stockton's troops got their first fight with Indians the morning after Christmas, 1867, while they were camped at abandoned Fort Lancaster. Several hundred Lipan Apaches, Kickapoos, Mexicans, and renegade whites surprised the soldiers and killed the 3 herd guards while the rest of the camp slept. 3 hours later, the troops were victorious, killing 20 and wounding many. 9 months later, 200 Apaches attacked a mule train near the fort and herded all the stock toward the Rio Grande. 61 soldiers and 10 civilian volunteers pursued them in a 5-mile running battle. The group of soldiers and volunteers killed 25 Indians, wounded an equal number, and recovered 200 animals and 2 captive Mexican children. Only 2 soldiers were wounded. By 1885, Fort Stockton commanded 3 sub-posts at Escondido Springs, Peña, Colorado, and Frazier's Ranch. Troops camped regularly at Santa Rosa Springs, Camp Van Camp, and other sites. Fort Stockton's troops provided escort service for travelers, stage lines, cattle drives, and commerce. They spent weeks on patrols, mapping and surveying the area, noting exact locations of all water sources and Indian camps. Life at the garrison was not all work. Dances were given in the barracks to welcome new officers and to honor visitors, especially ladies. Many travelers' journals noted the gaiety of these affairs and the welcome relief from the tedium and hard duty of life on the frontier. Holidays, especially Christmas and the 4th of July, were marked with special celebrations. Company funds were pooled to buy delicacies from the post trader for meals, and races and contests of various kinds provided comic relief from the hardships of frontier life. One officer at Fort Stockton reported on July 4th, 1882,
"I got up a big affair today. I invited ranchmen and cowboys to take an active part in the performances. My company put up a greased pole, and we had a pig shaved and greased. We got up a wheelbarrow race and sack race. Major McClellan excused his whole command in order that they might enjoy the fun. Had several splendid horse races."
Adolphina Wiedemeyer was one of the officers' wives who followed her husband to Fort Stockton. Captain William George Wiedemeyer of the 16th Infantry and his family lived here in 1884 and 1885. He recorded his life here at the post in his journal and with his camera.
When coming home, a wet norther came up and it got very cold. It began to snow before we got home and snowed all night, January 11th. I have been fixing my photographic apparatus and will be ready to begin work in a few days. Took a picture of Friedlander's store, which is now finished. He will take the plates east when he goes to be married to have them printed. The commanding officer of the 10th Cavalry here, Colonel Wade, whom I like, also his wife, who is a pleasant lady. She has 2 children, a boy and a girl, and a governess for them. Our home, Fort Stockton, Texas. The children in the buckboard. 10th Cavalry at Fort Stockton. L Troop, moving, 1884.
The soldiers loaded up their remaining supplies and left Fort Stockton in 1886, as the Indians by that date were no longer a threat to the area. The frontier was moving west, and with it moved the soldiers to fight the Apache in Arizona. The fort had been active for 19 years. Today, 3 officers' quarters remain of the original officers' row. The land and buildings reverted to civilian owners. Most of the vacant buildings were stripped of their valuable building materials and were left to weather and crumble. Officers' Quarters number 7 has been restored, leaving one room bare of interior plaster to reveal construction techniques unique to adobe materials. The guardhouse is the 4th remaining original building. The Fort Cemetery still exists north of the parade grounds, but no Army burials remain there. The Army removed all the soldiers and their dependents' remains to the National Cemetery in San Antonio for reburial, leaving only civilian graves here at the abandoned fort. In 1981, the city of Fort Stockton began a $1 million project of acquisition, restoration, and reconstruction of the fort. The remaining parade grounds and foundations of 2 enlisted men's barracks were cleared of brush. Extensive archaeological excavations preceded and documented the reconstruction of the barracks and 2 company kitchen mess halls. Historic Fort Stockton is listed on the National Register of Historic Sites. It is owned by the City of Fort Stockton and managed by the Fort Stockton Historical Society.